Today's discussion will revolve around the purpose of academic writing in the fields of critical writing and for research findings. Now, why is academic writing required at all? This is the question that we all ask. And to answer this fundamental question, one will need to understand what academic writing does. The function of academic writing is, we will see, to communicate ideas and arguments, usually through language in the written mode, with clarity and lucidity, so the written word is not lost in ambiguity. So the choice of word or lexis is very, very important. What word are you using? How are you using? And to what context? All need to understand that academic writing is not confined to a niche domain or discipline. What does that mean? That we have this idea academic writing is relevant only for maybe a couple of fields, but that is not the case. For different disciplines, it may have a unique set of qualities that distinctively mark it. But the basic premise will remain the same across disciplines. And we must move away from this misconception that it is relevant for higher education only or for writing dissertations and theses. There is a feeling that it is not meant for any other stage of academic enrollment below the doctoral stage. So we have to move away from all these myths and misconceptions when we come to academic writing, the concept, and why it is so important. When we are discussing academic writing, what does it really mean when someone says that a piece of writing is in the academic style, or that, this is part of scholarship, that it is very well written critically? These are comments that we find about a written piece of prose. It does not necessarily mean that many long, not in common use words or incomprehensible, grandiloquent words have been used in the excerpt. Not at all. It does not mean that it is dense prose and abstruse. But it does mean that the language will not be the everyday colloquial one, not the language that we use for speaking to each other in a very friendly manner. So it should avoid unnecessary shortenings or colloquialisms. For example, it is very common in conversation to use okay, ye, and various other words. But this unnecessary kind of elision is not required in academic writing. Another case you find about unnecessary elision that has become a feature of communication in the WhatsApp age. Would, the word WOULD has turned into WUD, and should, SHOULD, has turned into SHUD. One cannot indulge in this kind of informality when you are writing academic compositions. Apart from the above academic purposes, it can be observed that academic writing has multiple uses too in real life, in real world situations. So we were talking about only in the academic sphere earlier. That is an idea that we all have. But we also must understand that this is important in other spheres of life too. Why? Because it helps in honing our talents in various ways. It improves formal communication skills at work. It improves critical thinking for interviews and assignments. And when I say assignments over here, I do not mean educational assignments, but assignments at a professional setup. It also improves our writing for SOPs or job applications. While one develops the art of academic writing, some very necessary skill sets are also simultaneously developing. And what are these? Namely, What does academic writing help develop? It helps develop logical structuring and organizing skills. How are you going to put one sentence after another? How are you going to construct your argument? What are you going to put first and what are you going to put next? All this in a very structured manner you learn while you learn to write academic compositions. It helps develop a critical mindset. And this is the most important thing that you can learn, to develop a critical mindset. This is useful in any life situation as it is in academic work. So we are talking about how important the academic writing becomes in other situations apart from the academia. It helps develop analyzing skills. You read something and you learn to analyze it. And we will later on discuss how it is not just summarizing that we are talking about, but analyzing. So we have to pay attention to this concept of analysis rather than just, making a précis of it or summarizing it in ordinary descriptive terms. This also helps in collaborations and networking. Professional groups form, leading to knowledge sharing. And the next most important thing that academic compositions tell us is in documentation and transparency, especially through meticulous citations that we have to refer to. Academic writing, as already stated, builds communities of scholars. So let's come to the first quiz question that I wish to ask. Where can one use academic writing in a non-academic situation? Think, pause, and answer. The answer is writing statements of purpose or SOPs that we had talked about and applications for admissions into professional institutes or even applications for jobs or for asking for grants, etc. Purpose of academic writing, we can say in the academic sphere. Academic writing has many purposes, we have already said, but in the academic sphere, we can divide it into two broad units. These two broad units are relevant to the academic sphere. What are they? The first one is to help write critically. And this is going to become very important for us, to write critically as opposed to writing descriptively. And the second part is again very important, to share and express research findings. Forms of critical writing. We've been talking about critical writing. What are the forms of critical writing that you have? Individual essays. You have written essays and you will be writing essays, even if you're not writing a dissertation or a thesis. And then we come to the most important, again, point that students are interested in, answers to examination questions. Often students are told that answers are not critical, which means that answers are a summary of the text and does not show analysis. Analysis would mean not only familiarity with the text, but the ability to add a deeper perspective to the text by relating it to similar stories or essays or ideas or subjects linked and allied through references and illustrations. We were talking about the forms of critical writing. So where do we find examples of such essays? Writing essays for journals, magazines, publications. Then writing literature reviews before delving into research on a topic. You have to read a whole plethora of reviews and you have to put them down. Writing book reviews. For peer reviews of submissions, and again, writing answers based on texts. Now we are going to start with, examples, understanding what we have been talking about through examples and illustrations. The first example that I'm going to read is from an essay written by George Orwell called On Shooting an Elephant. This was published in the year 1936. And I'm going to read the first few lines. In Moma, in Lower Burma, I was hated by large numbers of people, the only time in my life that I have been important enough for this to happen to me. I was subdivisional police officer of the town, and in an aimless, petty kind of way, anti-European feeling was very bitter. No one had the guts to raise a riot, but if a European woman went through the bazaars alone, somebody would probably spit beetle juice over her dress. Now think on this passage. What does this passage talk about? This is about the author's experience when he was a police officer in Burma, and he was a representative of the empire, and he was in a kind of colony that had to be, ruled over by the empire long distance. So I have the example, from the text on one half of the page, and I will give you a very simple summary in the other half that is there. So what can we say about this passage that I just read out? We understand Orwell was working as a subdivision police officer in Moma in Lower Burma. Descriptive. He was hated by a large number of people. Again, descriptive. In that town, anti-European feeling was very bitter. Again, descriptive. Nobody had the courage to rebel or raise a riot. But if a European woman passed through the bazaars alone, somebody would spit beetle juice over her dress. He was an obvious target as a police officer because he was European. He was sneered at by young men everywhere and hooted at insultingly. So this is a summary of what George Orwell writes in the first few lines of the essay. The previous slide gave us a feel of descriptive writing or just summarizing. But now we will analyze the passage critically. When the author talks about the behavior of the local Burmans, as he calls them, he expresses both an anti-imperial as well as a colonial perspective and the complex intertwining of the two. The author is expressing or articulating a moral dilemma. He is both of the empire but sometimes critical of the empire. When we write in this fashion, we are creating academic writing for criticism, which also may be used for answer writing, writing for journals, magazines, etc. Now we will move on to a second illustration or example. This is from a very famous play, a play that is very common among students. People read it in schools. So we find over here Shakespeare's play Macbeth. I will read from Act 1, Scene 3. First witch, all hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis. Second witch, all hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor. Third witch, all hail Macbeth, thou shalt be king hereafter. And Macbeth's lines I will read. Stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more. By Sinel's death I know I am Thane of Glamis, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives, a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief. No more than to be Cawdor. Say from whence you owe this strange intelligence, or why upon this blasted heath you stop our way with such prophetic greeting. Speak, I charge you. The descriptive narrative is about a historical Scottish general who, helped by the prophecy of three witches and his wife's encouragement, kills his king and usurps the throne and thereafter faces death in a battle. So we all know the story of Macbeth, how Macbeth was encouraged to kill the king through the machinations of the witches. The witches prophesied that he would become king, and that is supposed to have made Macbeth kill the king. This is a narrative description that is very straightforward. This is not academic writing. If you want to make it academic writing, you have to analyze more things than just the words. Viewed critically, rather, we find Shakespeare presents a tale of crime and punishment, where Macbeth suffers pangs of conscience for having killed a benevolent king due to his overarching ambition, and suffers death as a form of moral restitution. So this is a critical observation on the story of Macbeth. You see how it changed. Initially, it was just a story of a man who was given a couple of prophecies by some witches that he met on the heath, and he believed them and he went and killed the king. There is no reference to his overvaulting ambition there. There is no reference to who these witches were. Were they real witches, or were they a kind of symbol that was being used by the playwright to forward certain ideas that he has? When we talk of symbols, we are thinking critically, because we are no longer thinking about one word which can be interpreted only from the surface reality of it. We go to a third example over here. And this is from a 20th century writer, George Bernard Shaw. You must have also heard of George Bernard Shaw. But here we are not talking about Shaw, the playwright. We are taking Shaw's essay, Freedom. And we find over here the lines, "What is a perfectly free person?" And it goes on to say, "Evidently a person who can do what he likes, when he likes, and where he likes, or do nothing at all if he prefers it. Well, there is no such person and can never be one." We can begin by observing that Shaw has raised a very controversial point by unilaterally announcing that there is nothing called a perfectly free person. So, what are we doing? We are thinking critically and we are analyzing critically, because we are saying that Shaw has raised a controversial point. We are no longer accepting Shaw's opinion without our own minds being engaged in it. We are not accepting it clearly. We are asking questions and we are trying to analyze what Shaw means with this observation that he makes. Shaw has said there can be never a perfectly free person. We may reflect on it and deny the validity of the statement or accept his argument. He has to provide logical evidence for us to accept. And that is what happens in the rest of the essay. I have not presented the rest of the essay, but we find that Shaw gives us logical explanations for this initial observation that he has, that there is nobody who's perfectly free. This is to refer to the essay that later on Shaw goes on to say how we have to eat, how we have to sleep, and this even if we don't wish to do so, and thus we are not perfectly free. It can be that we are slaves to nature because nature tells us to eat and sleep for our health, but Shaw says that we are not perfectly free. So see, Shaw had to provide certain logical arguments for us to accept it. And as readers, when we critically look at this, look at the valid observations that he makes, the logic that he has used, and then only accept his observations, then it becomes a kind of critical reading. And when we write on it, we are writing critically, and this gives us training in academic writing. So what do you have to do? You have to think on what we have read and you have to respond. Is Shaw correct in his observation? How does he defend his idea? Please reflect and respond. And this is what we find over here. What Shaw is hinting at is the fact that man being free in an absolute sense is a utopian idea. He categorically explains, taking each aspect separately, how man is not free because he has to eat and sleep whether he wishes to or not, and so is bound to nature. Logically, Shaw is establishing his point. When we read the essay through this logical lens and analyze whether we want to accept his argument, we are actually involved in critical thought. And when we express this critical thought in writing, we are critically writing or we are getting trained in academic writing. Now we come to the second point that we had raised, where academic writing becomes important. This is in the area of research. Let us examine the need for academic writing in research and research findings. Now, what is research? Most of us think of this scientist in a room, that is his laboratory, enclosed and confined and working and coming up with his eureka moment when he comes across some kind of new finding. It is not really so. Research is not merely a solitary intellectual pursuit. It is a conduit between investigation and a concluding inference. So, research is not effective without being expressed through academic writer for wider dissemination. What do I mean by that? If a scientist is making his experiments and he comes across some kind of new finding, a new conclusion, a new inference, unless he puts it down through academic writing, it will not reach the wider world. And if it does not reach the wider world, it will not add to the knowledge domain. And if it does not add to the knowledge domain, that research will be ineffective. So the purpose of academic writing through research, the most important purpose of academic writing is, of course, thus, as I said, related to research findings. As we discussed above, research does not achieve its goal if it is not disseminated in the knowledge domain and adds to existing scholarship. While, as I said before, the scientists may do experiments in isolation, it needs to be expressed in words and in the written mode to cover more readers and to be in the public domain forever. That is another reason why academic writing is important in research. Through academic writing, the research findings remain there forever in the scholarship domain. Academic writing helps in knowledge advancement. It helps in constructing an argument. It persuades the reader to the validity of the idea through logic, data, and evidence. Academic writing on a research topic will have a purpose, and the focus of the writing will be to validate that purpose. What does this mean? This means that research begins with an idea or a purpose. You want to find an answer to a question, or you want to find an answer to a need. So the first step would be to clearly express the basic premise or question that the research is looking to answer. The next step would be to collate all previous knowledge available on the topic. Then one has to define and state the methodology which is being used to search for answers. How are you looking for answers? What are you reading to find answers? And the moment you start reading, you start critically looking at the reading material. And then, before you conclude, you must write all this down. Then one needs to explain the findings in a structured manner. Last would be to show the trajectory that this line of enquiry may move towards in the future. So, we come to recapitulation or to summarize. What is academic writing? Writing that is on an idea that is structured, whose validity is proven through evidence and data, which is made in a formal tone, worked through logic and reasoning. It must be persuasive because that is the whole idea of academic writing. The reader must be persuaded as to the effectiveness of what he is reading. It must be verifiable. It should be non-fictional. So all these together constitute academic writing. But academic writing identifies a particular style of writing. So it is not only applicable for academic or educational issues. It may be helpful in other fields too. Basically, it helps hone and upskill an individual's capacity. So is a method of capacity building too. What do we mean by this? We have discussed how when we are being trained in the art of academic writing, many other aspects are also getting trained. We are becoming critical thinkers. We are becoming writers who think critically. We are developing a critical mindset, and we are becoming extremely sensitive to how we should go about writing what we have to write. Because the whole idea of academic writing is to make the reader believe in what we are writing. And when the reader believes in what we are writing, then only will our writing be successful. So we find over here that academic writing and composition becomes a very important training ground for multiple other benefits that accrues to a student, to a reader, to a scholar, to a researcher, and to a writer in various ways.